All right, we're just going to get the show on the road here today. We're having a live stream. This, once again, is an Ask Me Anything live stream. So any questions you might have, feel free to drop those in the question bar. And when I'm trying to answer them, I will link to them, and you should be able to see them on the screen, at least while I'm making the attempt to try to answer them. Now, I realized last week, if you watched my live stream last week, I wasn't sure that I was going to have one this week. And part of that's just because I was dropping my son off at college and getting him set up in his new dorm and all that. It's his first year at college, and so that I was over in Bozeman, and that's a bit of a drive home. I wasn't sure if I was able to get back in time, but as it turned out, it was a relatively straightforward drive from Bozeman back home. And so therefore I'm able to be here in time for the live stream today. And but I wasn't able to get back in time to do really any additional videos. So this week's going to be a little light on the video front, and we'll just have to make up for it this next week. And of course, if you're watching the live stream, you'll be able to ask me any questions that you might have. There's been a few things going on in the political world since the last time I did a video, and since the last time I did a live stream for sure. I think we can jump right in and probably get to some of these questions that you might have. Just a real quick heads up, if you hit the @We the Governed, it's just a little bit easier for me to actually see your question kind of pop up on the screen that I have here. The reason is I know there's a lot of commentary that tends to go back and forth, which is great. But when I'm trying to actually get to questions, I have to kind of filter through that in order to find the questions that you might have. And so if you happen to be wanting to ask me a question, just try to remember to hit that @We the Governed. If I happen to notice as I'm scrolling down through the commentary and that you've asked a question, I'll jump on that one. But oftentimes I do miss that as I'm looking through it. And my experience the last few months has been there's been so many comments and questions that start to come through, it becomes hard to necessarily pull those questions out. So looking forward to some of the questions that you might have here. One thing, just a real quick, I was going to mention it to everybody. Thank you guys so much for watching my YouTube channel and for subscribing to it. Just recently, a few days ago, we crossed the 3 million view mark, which is a big deal if you're ever tracking a YouTube channel viewership. And if you ever want to just know what the actual number of views on a channel are, or how many videos they have out, or when they've been around, I always go to, I know there's a variety of websites you can go to, but I go to socialblade.com. You can type in We the Governed there, and you can actually see some of the stats about our channel or about any other YouTube channel that you might see out there. So if you go look at that, you'll see that we cleared 3 million views here just, I think it was late last week. But that's thanks to you and thanks to other people that you share these videos with. And I really appreciate your support and your willingness to subscribe to the channel. And hopefully I continue to provide you value so that this is a useful program for you and useful videos and information for you to get. So one thing I'm going to jump right into, and this is actually the first question that I think we have here. By Ben Garrett, and actually you jumped in here, you were going to be talking about Sue Peterson only trails up the Grove by 9 votes, and then you said now it's 6 votes, and now you said she's ahead by 4 votes. Let me just jump in on this race as far as I know now. Ben, I'm not sure actually where you're getting your numbers from exactly, but I did check the Secretary of State website just before I went live here, and it looks like, and by the way, this is as far as I can tell, this is actually an exceptional primary result as far as the difference between 2 candidates. And for the Public Lands Commissioner race, the whole state of Washington, you had Jamie Herrera Butler, who's a Republican, who got the largest number of votes, about 419,000 votes. So she's definitely moving on to the general election. The real question is, who does she run against? And it's kind of fluctuated back and forth between the leading Democrat, who is Dave Upthegrove, and the other Republican, who was endorsed by the Republican Party officially at their convention earlier this year, and that was Sue Peterson. And the reason why, if you're logging in from another state and you're wondering how the heck could you have 2 Republicans in the general election, is because Washington State is a jungle primary, and so the top 2 vote getters in just an everything goes primary, those are the two people, the two candidates that basically move on to the general, regardless of party affiliation. That's why you have a couple of legislative races in the state where you have two Republicans on the ballot. You also, like in the 39th and the 2nd, which I think I discussed in one of my videos last week. That's also why you have a few races where there are two Democrats on the ballot, particularly in very deep blue kind of areas of Washington state where the Republicans either didn't run anybody or they didn't have anybody effective to get through that primary. But it's not often that we see this happen at the statewide level, at least where you get two Republicans on the ballot. The last time that actually happened was in 2016 with the state treasurer's race when Dwayne Davidson in the end became the first Washington state Republican treasurer since, I believe, the early 50s, if I remember right now. So he served for 4 years as a Republican elected statewide because two Republicans in that primary election came through. I actually featured that race as well. If you saw the video that I produced over the weekend about why and how money matters in politics, that was an interesting race just to look at because the person who had the most amount of money was not the person who won that election in the end. And so it was an interesting just observation about how underfunded campaigns, what are the types of scenarios that pop up that allow them to actually prevail in the final election process. But regardless, this is highly unusual to have Soquel, Peterson, and Up the Grove separated after all these votes have been counted by a very small number of votes. Now, Ben, I'm not sure again where you got those numbers from exactly, but when I look at the Secretary of State's numbers at this point in time, there is a 51 vote difference. And for example, it looks like Up the Grove right now has 396,300 votes, and Soquel Peterson has 396,249 votes. And that's 59 votes down, but that is a statistical tie at a statewide election where each person has about, almost 396,300 votes, roughly. They're very close, just within a few votes apart. So I don't see how they can avoid, I believe that triggers a mandatory statewide recount. And when I say statewide recount, I believe that's so close that it actually requires a mandatory statewide hand recount. So that is going to be really interesting. Technically today, it is August 20th, and so the counties, the auditors, this is the day that all 38 county auditors, and then the elections department of King County, they have to certify their election numbers today. But the Secretary of State has 3 days to formally certify their results. And this statewide election right now, I don't think anybody was anticipating this. They're going to have to do a hand recount, as best I can tell, to determine which of these two candidates actually get on the ballot. Obviously, it would be awesome if you had two Republicans get on the ballot for the general election for another statewide office. Like I said, it's been a few years since that's happened, 8 years actually, but it would be fun to see that happen again, and it would be great for this position in our state in particular to finally get somebody in there, regardless actually of which Republican would get in there, who actually doesn't want to destroy our forests and burn it all down for the sake of saving the environment. Remember, that's been the basic policy that the environmentalists have had in Washington state, is that in order to save our forests, first they need to let them burn down and be destroyed. So that's been a consistent policy since the Democrats occupied that office in the last 15 or so years, 16 years. So it'd be really interesting to actually get, or I guess it's a little bit less than that, 12, how long has it been? 12 years, I think, since it was Goldmark and then Hillary Franz. Neither one of them friends of healthy forests, but at this point in time, it would be a really big policy change to actually get a Republican in that office. But it is down to the wire, and this is an incredibly close recount process. So if you ever want to be involved in observing a recount, this is your chance, because looks to me like pretty much every county, the state's going to have to do a recount on this one. So that's just how it looks. And it could be that a lot of the counties have already done hand recounts. I don't know, but that is an incredibly close race for a statewide office. If you know of any other really close races like this that are within, less than 0.1% or something like that, let me know, because those are the fascinating things for those of us who care about elections and who want to just pay attention to some of the more wonkish things that do happen in the election process. I'm pretty amazed at what's actually happened here. So let's see if I can get to Here's my next question here. Larry, the Eater, saying, what is your favorite city in Washington State? I do have a number of cities I like around Washington, cities and towns, actually. Where I grew up originally, where our farm was originally, it used to be unincorporated King County, but it became the city of Newcastle later. So, of course, I do have a soft spot in my heart for Newcastle. When I kind of like Kent a lot, and part of this is because when my parents got divorced, I ended up living in West Hill, Kent, and so I spent a lot of time in Kent as a kid, riding my bike down in Meeker's Landing and just exploring Kent in general. Now I live more on the West Hill, but so Kent again, another soft spot just because I lived there for a while. Also, I lived up in Bellingham for a number of years after I graduated from college, and so I've always had a fondness for Bellingham. I've spent a lot of time in the San Juans. I was kind of like Friday Harbor. It's just a classic little town that it is, and I was just up there a couple weeks ago as the MC for the Lincoln Day dinner, and that was kind of fun. Always fun to be up in the San Juans. I also have had, my family lives all over Washington State, but I did spend a lot of time in Colville and a little bit in Kettle Falls when I was younger. And so I've always enjoyed just kind of being over there in that part of the state as well. Because my family's fifth generation Washingtonian, we spent a lot of time, and I have a large family, extended family in Washington State, and so I feel like I have a lot of attachments to just a lot of different places in Washington. But there are interesting and fun things about each of the states. I actually think Washington's an amazing place with a lot of neat places, a lot of wonderful places that are oftentimes underexplored and underappreciated by those who haven't been there. Or seen it before themselves. So it's hard for me to really totally pick on just one, but that just gives you kind of a rough sample. Don't know if I really answered that question very well, Larry, but hopefully that helped. And for some odd reason here, I'm not really getting the questions there, so I'm going to look over my other screen and see if I can catch up to where some of these questions are. And fortunately, I have a couple different ways of getting to your questions here. Let's see. I have another question here. This is another question from Ben. Currently, Peterson. Ben, you're jumping in actually on this, but currently Peterson leads Up the Grove by 34 votes. How long do you think it'll take until the race is called? There will be a mandatory recount, most likely. Yeah, and as I just mentioned, there will be a recount in the Public Lands Commissioner race, and I don't think there's any way to avoid that. So sorry about this. I'm not able to pop the questions up for whatever reason right now as I get to them. So I'm just going to start pulling those questions in off my other screen here and doing my best to answer them as you send them my way. So let's see. There's another question about from Thunderstriker. You're asking me, you're flying into town and you're asking me about any Republican events between the 22nd or political events anyway, between the 22nd and the 26th. And right now I'm not aware of any that are going on. If anybody else knows any, at least I don't have any intention to attend any during that period of time. So if there's something else I should be aware of here as August is coming to an end, let me know. And if so, maybe we get a chance to actually meet there. And as it looks like you're going to be in our neck of the woods from Arizona. Got another question here from Greg. What are your thoughts on the likelihood that the four initiatives pass, yes votes, in November? Specifically, the capital gains tax for getting the capital gains tax repealed and the Will Bob poll nonsense to get it removed. Well, I'm going to tell you, there's a couple of, based on basic polling and surveys and the popularity of these four initiatives, I would say that all things being equal, probably all four initiatives are likely to pass. The capital gains tax repeal is going to be the least popular of those four initiatives to pass. But I think the campaign of Vote Yes, Pay Less, if one of them passes, it seems like most of them, if not all of them, do pass. Now, there are games being played, as many of you know, and I did a video on this, and also I went to the Let's Go Washington event earlier, or I should say last week, that was downtown. It was actually downtown Seattle outside of the Attorney General's office on Fifth Avenue. And it was a great event. In fact, I used those photos as part of my thumbnail when I launched the video just about Ferguson's games regarding trying to keep it secret, the fact that some of the billionaires like Bill Gates and Nick Hanauer were trying to use sneaky legal tactics to try to throw it off the ballot. And they failed in that effort, but Ferguson really tried to keep that whole process secret from the prime sponsors of the initiative, which is illegal and probably was one of the reasons why the Supreme Court totally threw it out. However, it was indicative of the fact that Ferguson is not a honest player in this process. Of course, he never has been, and that would be unusual for him to suddenly become one. So I would expect that the other thing that you're going to see, and I think it's made the news just recently, are these personal impact statements, which are basically an effort of the state. Mostly the Democrats and the bureaucrats of the state of Washington have hated the fact that the voters of Washington have been able to repeal tax increases or reduce tax burdens via the initiative process. Tim Eyman, of course, was famous for doing this over the years. And there's nothing that drives bureaucrats and grifters and the Democrats in general crazier than having some of their anticipated tax dollars taken away from them and kept in the pockets of the taxpayers themselves. Letting people spend their own money is probably the greatest crime that a bureaucrat or a Democrat politician could ever imagine. And so anything that people do to try to claw back some of their own money and prevent the state from squandering and wasting it or grifting it away to special interests like they do in our state, that is a threat to their, of course, grifting operations that they run at pretty much all levels of government in Washington today. So they hate the fact that voters in Washington, even when they sometimes, which has always been this disconnect, even when they'll vote Democrat, they'll oftentimes, a sizable percentage of them, will still vote to repeal the taxes that those very same Democrat politicians support, or liberal Republicans in some cases. So it's always been this issue for the last 20 years or so where it's really gotten a lot of attention. And so there's been a lot of games that you've seen the Democrats and then some corrupted Republicans at the same time be willing to play and make it harder, or at least less likely, that the voters have an opportunity to repeal some of these taxes. One of them, for example, was getting rid of the basically the effort that you've seen over the last, I think this was an Eyman initiative too originally, I don't remember the initiative number, but it would allow advisory votes on tax increases that the legislature had proposed. It was a great way of actually tracking how disconnected and completely out of touch the politicians really are when they pass stupid taxes. And sometimes how the voters will support certain taxes. You could actually distinguish this based on the advisory votes that people would have. And the politicians in Olympia despised and hated this. And that includes the Republicans, the handful who love taxes just as much as the Democrats. They didn't like it either. And so they fought for years to get rid of these advisory votes so that people wouldn't see how unpopular their decisions to pass and increase taxes at various times really were. That's an example. Another example of this was these impact statements that you'll see on the ballot coming up in November, where the AG gets to, and the state really gets to put their finger on the scales trying to convince people not to vote for the tax cuts. And they do this by saying, oh, if you vote for this tax cut, widows and orphans will be thrown in the street. The education system gets destroyed. The whole edifice of our corrupt and incompetent bureaucracy comes collapsing to the ground. Please, dear God, don't vote for these taxes. That's essentially what it is. It's like a Rule 1 statement, but it's always the same. It's the same cry wolf that they've had for the last 50 years in government, that if the voters dare try to reduce their taxes, that it's going to be the end of the world and it'll just be a total disaster. And they say this with a straight face, even when they lose, $1 billion in their stupid employment security scam, even when they lose millions and millions of dollars in very foolish squandering of resources all the time. That's an example of how they're going to try to push the scales, even though with those impact statements, and this will be the first year, I believe, that we'll see initiatives on the ballot that have those, it does appear that most of these initiatives will poll very positively, and I would anticipate that the voters pass them. However, let's just say they do get passed. What can happen after that? Well, one of the things that can happen, and I would anticipate it happening, is the fact that there will be legal challenges, inevitably. This always comes down to this distributed cost, concentrated benefits problem, and I've discussed this before, but it ends up being a real challenge when you're trying to control government, or at least control the bloat and growth of government, because what happens is the bigger and more bloated government becomes, all this cash is getting filtered into a small group of people or bureaucrats or special interests who profit. So the concentrated benefits to them are immense because they're getting millions and millions of your dollars. And the individual taxes that they're siphoning away into their back pockets, they're distributed across the whole population. And so a very small percentage of elite kind of bureaucrats and special interests, they're taking all your money and squandering it on whatever their special interests are. But for them, it's life or death. And so there's literally nothing they won't do. They'll break any law they have to. They'll lie. They'll falsify documents. They'll conceal documents. They'll destroy public records. They'll litigate. They'll attack you in the media. They'll do whatever they have to do to keep their special interests, slice of the pie coming. And they'll always attack anybody who dares to raise the question about trying to cut your taxes, right? I've written con statements in voters' guide ballots or voters' guides before where you have a con and a pro and a con statement on a tax increase. And I've written the con statement numerous times in the past on local tax increases, and they hate that. They want to attack you. They put all this money and resources into trying to write the pro statement, and usually it's just a ragtag group of people that are trying to oppose those tax increases, and they will threaten you. They will do all kinds of crazy stuff to keep that money train coming their way. Again, concentrated benefits for them. It's huge. And distributed costs to all the rest of us. It's very rarely worth the drama and energy and threats and litigation or other things for individuals who step up to the plate and say, I'm going to try to stop this stupid, wasteful tax increase, for example, or roll it back. And so that's one of the games they play to reduce the likelihood that you would dare stand up or push back against them. We see it all the time. Saw it with Tim Eyman most extremely, but even with Brian Haywood, who has done the state a tremendous service in getting all four of these initiatives on the ballot with his Let's Go Washington team. You see them attacking him. They're running these multi-million-dollar attack ads, essentially, and they're afraid to even address the issues that are raised with the taxes. Like they realize that the policies are very unpopular, and supporting them it's very hard to really, it's a small group of people that are profiting from the support, the hidden gas tax, the kickback scheme associated with SEIU's payroll tax for the long-term care scam. All that stuff is very nasty and ugly when you look at how the money's squandered. And so defending it on its policy, for policy reasons, is almost impossible, really. So what you have to do is you have to attack personally anybody who dares to try to reduce those taxes. And that's the game that gets played. And so it's this constant push back and forth, this process, and we'll see it play out here in November a bit as I think the voters of Washington State, if any of the surveys are to be believed at all, clearly these are very popular proposals, especially in light of the economic downturn that most people in the country are experiencing. I understand if you're a wealthy Microsoft guy or you're getting your stock options from Amazon and you live in a multi-million-dollar home up in Kirkland, you probably love the taxes. But everybody else who actually has to work for a living in day-to-day type jobs, they are experiencing inflation. They're experiencing all these other problems. The cost of driving to work, the cost of just living, the energy increases, all these other things that really does affect most people outside of this very insulated bubble of the elite. And so the average person, even if they don't admit it, the wine and cheese club meeting that they might go to, they are actually going to vote yes to pay less, I think, in November. The litigation that happens after that, we will have to see, and we'll have to cross that bridge when we get there. And I'm very sorry I can't pull up the questions and put them down below. I'm just, for some reason, not able to get that to happen here, so I'll have to go off on my other screen, and I'll pull up the questions here. Let's see. Here's a question. I see Perez is flooding the airways. And let's see. Sorry, I have to get past that. Perez is flooding the airways, and even YouTube with ads. Is Joe Kent that short on money, or just waiting until later? Okay, so you're talking about the 3rd Congressional District, which is where I live. I'm kind of in the very north end of the 3rd Congressional District. And what Jack is referencing in that question there is the fact that the incumbent, Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, Congresswoman Marie Perez is spending a lot of money on ads, we're going into the last few months before the election. Remember, in Washington State, it may be late August right now, and they haven't quite certified the general election or the primary election yet. But in Washington State, you're really only about a little less than 2 months away from the ballots dropping, and your advertising dollars have to be spent now. And I believe that Perez was slightly under 45%. That's not particularly fun or slightly over 45%, I think, in her case. In the primary election, that's dangerous territory for incumbent politicians, doesn't matter what party you're in. And so she has a lot more money and a lot of outside money coming in to try to defend and protect that seat, because nationwide, that seat is viewed as one of the most likely Democrat-controlled congressional seats in the whole country. That's one of the ones that's most likely to flip from Democrat to Republican. So I would anticipate massive amounts of money coming into that district to defend that seat with Perez. And you can't blame her. I would probably do this exact same thing if I was in her shoes, because right now there's no point in holding on to your money. You need to spend it all right now, all the way up until the very last second, because you need every vote you can get. Especially in a district that's probably going to vote for Trump, historically has voted for Trump multiple times now, and it leans Republican. So it's tough if you're a Democrat congresswoman in that position. So that's what she's going to do. I'm not sure what Joe Kent's campaign's plans are from an advertising standpoint. I do believe that his campaign has done a pretty good job running the grassroots side of things and just the basic get out the vote effort. There's obviously outside groups that are going to be coming in, putting money into both sides of this race. I would anticipate that you'll see probably a little bit more formal advertising from the Joe Kent side of things now that the primary is over, but we'll have to see. I'm not on the inside of that campaign either. I was there for Joe Kent's primary election night party, but that's why you're going to see these ads. I expect to be just flooded with these ads all the way till the bitter end of November. So I think that's what's going to be going on there. Good question, Jack. Thank you for asking that one. Let's see. Julie Anderson, you're asking a question commonly that has come up. Does Dave Reichert have a chance? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. One of the things to remember about the governor race right now, and I haven't gotten into a lot of detail. This probably would be a worthwhile thing to look at from an election summary video. But the leading Democrat right now is, and with essentially no competition on the Democrat side at all, is Bob Ferguson. And yet he was not even able to get 45%. It looks like he was actually under 45% in the general election, or in the primary election. And that is a terrible place to be for a front runner. Now, keep in mind, he spent a ton of money. He spent, I believe, about $7 million to get 45% of the vote. Now, it's easy to look at it and say, okay, but Dave Reichert got far fewer votes than Ferguson did, and that's true. But you had a lot of anti-Ferguson votes spread across multiple voters there, multiple voter groups of people, who, if they had liked Ferguson or the Democrats' chosen person for this position, they would have aligned behind Ferguson, and they did not. And so you have a very competitive race now coming into the general election in the governor's race, probably the most competitive since 2012, because primarily of this pushback against Ferguson. And he's not viewed very positively. There's a big chunk of Democrats that don't like him. He's very nasty to people on his own side. He has not done a good job as Attorney General, and not a memorable job for anybody that really cares. His pro-crime policies for 12 years hasn't really resulted in anything positive. He knows that as well, because Ferguson's done his own surveys, or at least had independent surveys done on his behalf, and they clearly show that he's very weak in the public safety area. And so Ferguson's trying to pretend like he just discovered public safety yesterday, but I don't think it's that realistic. It doesn't seem to come across very honestly anywhere he goes. Now, when he went to the Chamber of Commerce meeting in King County here recently, he wouldn't take any questions. He's just kind of a smash and grab guy. He goes in, he says a couple things, and he runs out of the room as fast as he can. He is afraid of the voter, and he's afraid of the people who live here, because he's got a track record that's not doesn't really merit a lot of joy when he's trying to reach across the aisle, or even, I think that's probably an exaggeration. It's really more him trying to pretend to people who are less involved in the political process that they should actually vote for this guy. He's the opposite of charismatic. He's not terribly interesting, et cetera, et cetera. And Reichert now, who will be on the ballot against him, does have a clear and strong law enforcement background as a former sheriff of King County. So essentially that's the fight that's going on here, and it really depends on voter models and turnouts and how they actually vote in November. I'd be very surprised if there's some kind of October surprise in the governor's race, partially just because I think the presidential drama and chaos at a national level is just going to suck most of the oxygen out of the room. The truth is 90% of the people that are paying attention to politics don't pay attention at all at a local level, even from governor's race on down. And so they're obsessed and looking at what they see on Fox News or at MSNBC or wherever they're getting their news. And so those people are mostly reporting on this national battle between Trump and Kamala Harris or Biden or whatever's going on, on the Democrat side. But nevertheless, there's drama there, and it's national, and everybody's impacted by it, and that's where all the clicks are, that's where all the interest is. And so a lot of the things, even like a governor's race in Washington, it does get pushed into the background. And so it's very hard to even get any attention on anything that happens locally. Now, if you're going to get some, you're going to get it in the governor's race. But we'll just have to see if there's anything like that pops out of there. But it's an opening for a Republican. One of the things that has to happen usually is that Republicans have to run really good campaigns. And the challenging part of that is that there aren't really any Republican-leaning or Republican-associated consultants that know how to win. Losing is the primary objective and result of Republican consultants in Washington state. It's very hard to find one that knows how to win at all. Now, they know how to promote themselves. They just don't know how to promote their candidates and help them win. And so the challenge oftentimes for, I think, Republican statewide candidates is to run campaigns that aren't just incompetent disasters. It's very difficult. It's very hard for them to do that. And you saw that recently. I did a video on some of the Republican established supported candidates who had hundreds of thousands of dollars thrown behind their campaign, and they got crushed in their respective primaries around the state. Now, they got crushed by other Republicans, but the traditional Republican consultants and the smart class within that sphere were the ones who ran those campaigns for their supported and chosen candidates, and in almost every case they were complete disasters and failed in every measurable way. So they squandered tons of money and couldn't even win in a primary. How are these guys actually going to be able to run a race that's successful in the general? And I think that should normally, in a normal setting, if you run a business or something, that would require you to do some soul searching. You try to look back and say, well, we blew $1 million and got nothing to show for it. Maybe we're just as incompetent as Glenn says we are, and we need to go back and look at how to do things a little bit better. I don't anticipate that soul searching going on because, of course, if you actually thought that way, you would fire the people who currently run those political races, and I don't see anybody doing that anytime soon. So therefore, the Republican candidates that are running for whatever offices they have to just run effective campaigns that help them win less by accident and more on purpose. And we will have to see how that works. It's not easy. Statewide campaigns in particular are very challenging. But there is some truth that how people vote at the top of the ballot tends to trickle down in how they vote down below. And the biggest change, unique in living history in Washington state for this November of 2024, are those 4 initiatives: the Vote Yes, Pay Less program. A lot of apathetic or otherwise uninterested voters, I suspect, are going to come out to vote yes on those initiatives. If for no other reason than they're upset and annoyed about the cost of living and how it's impacting their lives, and to reduce that cost, they want to vote yes. And if they keep going down that ballot, my suspicion is that most of those people are going to vote against the established sort of party folk that are on the ballot. And in Washington state, that means mostly Democrats. So if you're voting against them, that means the Republicans could benefit a lot from that type of voter turnout. We'll have to see. It's never been done before. Nobody really knows how to model this exactly. Anybody who thinks they have doesn't probably know what they're talking about. So there's big question marks out there right now as to what it means. But it seems to me that if there's ever a time for a Republican to win a governor's race, this has been set up to be one of those times. What probably hurts Washington a little bit is having Trump on the ballot, because not so much on the Republican side, but it hurts on the Democrat side, because there's a lot of Democrats highly motivated to vote against Trump more than they're motivated to do anything else. And so, again, a lot of people maybe on the conservative side or the middle of the road side are going to vote yes on those initiatives. And presumably they might vote for anti-establishment people down below, which generally would benefit Republicans. On the other hand, you got a lot of Democrats that are jumping in this race because they hate Trump so much. I don't even know if they'll vote on anything else, but they're definitely going to vote against Trump. And so some of them will also go down that ballot and vote probably Democrat, I would assume. So there's just a lot of unknowns, I think, coming out of this election cycle and going into it. We're only a couple, like I said, October 18th, technically, is when they start collecting those ballots for the election, and it's going to be chaotic, in my opinion. Let's see. Rage against the 1%. Yeah, Rock, I saw your question there, comment about the rage against the 1%. I'm sure that's probably true. We're going to see some of that going on right now. I think we're going to see more of that as time goes by. Let's see. Jason, you got a question here. This is a good question. Why do you have, what's the reason for having two laptops? Great question here. Normally the laptop I have right here is the one where I have the questions, and you'll see them up down below me. You can see the comments or the questions down here, and it's off of this screen. Well, right now I'm having problems with it, so I can't show you the questions that I'm trying to answer right now, which is why I'm going to take that off right now. However, I have this backup laptop that's here just in case something like this happens. So that's why I have two, trying to always be prepared and try to have things work as much as possible. I'm in the studio alone usually when I'm doing this, and so my tech guys are awesome, and I love them, but if they aren't here, they're not able to fix whatever this problem is, and I'm too incompetent to do it. So giving me a couple of options, that's what allows me to kind of keep the show going, and I will try to answer your questions, even if you can't see them. I love that feature, being able to see the questions down below, but we'll have to do it without that here moving forward. Let's see. Good evening, Glenn. I finally making it live. Thank you always for answering questions on after show comments. Yeah, I do try to do that as much as I can. That was from D. Rambo. Always a good name, I guess, to put in the comment section. There's another question here from Greg. If elected, is there a path for Reichert and or Serrano to get rid of the assault weapon ban and other gun control laws in Washington? Sure there is. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's always a path to get rid of them, regardless of whether they're elected or not, just because of the unconstitutionality of the law in the first place. Primarily, that path, though, usually involves legal action of one kind or another. So when it's recognized as being unconstitutional, that's when those laws tend to go away. And so, yes, you could see that kind of a change occurring, but it may occur whether they're in there or not, just for clarity's sake. Then I got a question from North Song. Is there a cap on the percentage the government can raise property taxes? We have commercial property that was raised by 60% in Seattle. So one of the challenges when you're looking at property, that's a great question, by the way. One of the challenges when you're looking at property tax increases year over year is that there's essentially two elements to the property tax equation that you have to look at. One is kind of this, the valuation of the property, which is different than the tax itself being increased. There is a limitation on how much taxes can be increased year over year, still at 1% a year. But that's misleading because it really depends on the value of your property and where your property's increased or not. So you get around that 1%, sort of, or at least you as an individual get impacted by that 1%, especially on commercial property, based on what the Washington State Department of Revenue calls the coefficient of dispersion of how they create valuation in the property. So in theory, all the properties are supposed to be treated the same in the sense that they're accurately assessed, closest to their true value that the assessor's office can possibly come up with, and that because of the way most property taxes are collected, I say most because there's some variation here, but there's a fixed budget, and they're collecting that budget to spread around all the properties based on equal valuation, in the sense that $100,000 of property over here is paying taxes on that $100,000, just like the $100,000 property over here. But if you have a $10 million property value over here and a $50,000 property value over here, obviously they're going to be paying substantially different amounts on their property taxes. So most likely what you had happen recently is your assessor, or at least they'll claim, that they went through and did their reappraisals, which under state law they have to do it once every 6 years, and lo and behold, the value of your property is shot up so high that because of that, you're paying a lot more property taxes, and it's improved, or it's increased its value substantially compared to everybody else around you as well. So that's where this coefficient dispersion really starts to kick in, and as you get those, you're paying more. Now, arguably, there are some taxes that are assessed as like a fixed amount. Usually it's things like your conservation money that it's usually small amounts. You see those little small line items in your property taxes. But most of your property tax, probably about 58% of it, give or take, depending on which county you're in, goes to schools one way or another. Roughly 25% of that's going to the state, so that they can siphon a percentage of that money out and throw it away at OSPI. And then they filter it back into your local schools, and then another 25% or more, so it's usually local levies that are applied. Now that number's sometimes off, but if you add both of them together, it tends to be around that 58% range. It's really just all going into your local schools, bonds, levies, et cetera. Then about 11, depending on which county you're in, sometimes 11 to 13% goes into county government. If you're in state, if you live in the city, that percentage is oftentimes just a little bit lower, and your city percentages are a little bit higher. You also have fire districts. You have Medic 1 that are little slices of the pie. You have your conservation district that I mentioned earlier. You have other little random small taxing districts that kind of descending order fill in the rest of that, the amount of money you're paying. Yes, it's absolutely true that a lot of your tax dollars get wasted and squandered by the people who take them. They don't care. Bureaucrats are almost never held accountable, and it's one of my concerns of the overall bloat of government and how to hold government more accountable. It's one of the reasons why I've got involved in this process, is that that tax burden that you suffer under needs to be reduced overall. It just does. We have to shrink the size of government. It's the only way to restore freedom and liberty in our country, is to reduce the bloat of the administrative state and the kind of that distributed costs, concentrated benefits concern that I have in the past. Once you have these people who are profiting so immensely from the amount of money they're extracting from you that they will do anything, legal or illegal, to retain that cash flow, we have something that's out of control, and we have to deal with it. And in government, one of the ways of doing that is just cutting the taxes and reducing it. And you want to do it intelligently. You want to focus it on the policies that are most obvious that you can clean up and start getting rid of. But it takes a lot of work, because at the same time, there's things that people do want to support with their tax dollars. Generally, they want public safety, for example. There's a number of other things. They want bridges that don't collapse. Even though Washington State's Department of Transportation has a difficult time with that, they generally want predictable government sort of paid for projects that function. Washington State does a terrible job with the money that we give it, and so do a good percentage of our local governments, but there's still aspects of that people generally, when you see surveys, that they do want to support and they want to have that function. You're just paying way too much for it. And almost any other option you have would be less expensive. And let me see if I can get to the next one. Here's a question from Gregorius Greg. Are you going to interview any candidates before the election? It would be great. I would love to. I'm not sure if I can. One of the issues that I have is that there's a studio that I'm filming in right now, and this is located in Clark County, and it's not easy for candidates to get here all the time. And so it's a great place to do interviews, and I've done some in the past, and you've seen them. I interviewed Semi Bird a while ago. I've interviewed Jim Walsh here. I've interviewed Brian Haywood in the studio before. But it really has more to do with their schedule and the schedule that I have here at the studio, and it's very hard to line those up, especially in that home stretch before the election. We will see. If I can do that, I definitely will, and I like interviewing candidates. I'm not trying to play gotcha, so I'm really just trying to get a better sense of who these candidates are, and this is particularly true in the lower level, executive level sort of positions, the state auditor, state treasurer, secretary of state, all these kind of positions, public lands commissioner, all these positions that people don't tend to pay as much attention to. these are good positions for you to at least get a sense of who these people are running for office. And if I get a chance to interview them, I absolutely will. Don't have anything scheduled right now. Let's see. Will Seattle, this is a question from Kathleen, and it's actually Kathleen Music. Will Seattle dictate the election again? Well, Seattle has a big impact in King County, and it definitely does. And so the tendency, of course, is to believe that however Seattle goes is how the rest of the state goes. It doesn't always happen that way, but it certainly is an impact. I would say that the bigger way to look at that is King County. The greater Seattle area is the concentrated population of Washington State. And it's generally viewed as necessary for a Republican in order to win a statewide office, that they need to get around 40% of King County, one way or the other. Now, that doesn't mean you get a majority of Seattle. It just means that within the greater King County area, you got 1.2 million or so voters in King County. So you're going to have about 25% or so of the total votes going to come out of the King County. And of that, a decent percentage of that's coming out of Seattle. I actually don't know those percentages off the top of my head, but now that you're asking me the question, I'll have to go back and look and measure those numbers again. However, because of that 40% threshold, when you look at it, that's really one of the numbers and metrics that political insiders are going to look at on the likelihood of a political candidate being able to succeed in a general election. One of the numbers I would caution, or I would have you look at, is just look at the OSPI race, which I might do right now. I think I can do that while I'm talking to you here. And that is, if you look at, let's see, voter turnout. I'll look at King County. One of the things I want to reference when I'm talking about that percentage is what percentage a incumbent, for example, might be getting inside of the King County area. And you can look at that easiest on the Secretary of State website. And you would say, okay, I'm looking at, the one I'm looking at is OSPI. That's the race I want to look at here. Let's see. Chris Reichel. So Chris Reichel right now is the incumbent, and he's in trouble potentially in King County, because he's going to lose the majority of counties in Washington State. So there's going to be probably right now it's going to be Dave Olson who's running against him. He's going to be losing a sizable percentage of votes in most counties to Dave Olson. Dave Olson's going to come into the election with a benefit from a large number of counties in Washington State. Probably about, out of the 39, Dave Olson will probably be leading for sure in about 34 of those, maybe 35 of them for sure. Dave Olson's not going to be leading in San Juan County or Jefferson County, but who cares? Those are small counties anyway. But he's going to be leading a lot of others, some of them small, some of them big. Then the question comes King County. Now, this is a nonpartisan race, and so Chris Reichel is the incumbent OSPI director, Office Superintendent of Public Instruction, did horribly. And he did terribly because he needs to not just win in King County, he needs to dominate King County, and he got less than 50% of the vote in King County. In fact, the opponents, Dave Olson and Reed Saras, who was the other guy running against Chris Reichel there, if you can add their numbers together, it really does look like you're talking about a 47% opposition to Chris Reichel, which is largely what that was. So if Olson's able to retain, say, 40%, maybe he doesn't get the full 47%, but he gets about 40% of that vote in King County, Dave Olson will be the next Office Superintendent of Public Instruction person. He'll be the guy elected to that race, and the incumbent, Chris Reichel, is going to lose. If David's able to get that, or pretty close to that number in the final election numbers in November. Same is true for a couple of these other races. I don't want to get into all of them right now, but basically that's typically how they're going to do the math on looking at your likelihood of being able to prevail in the general election as a Republican. When they look at King County, they're looking at that percentage number there. I remember talking to Kim Wyman once after she'd won her election, and she had a strong reservoir of support in Thurston County, and that's where she grew up. That's where she'd worked. She had a lot of professional relationships in Thurston County. It doesn't matter whether you like Kim Wyman or not. That's just the reality, and that's the truth. And so she always was able to overperform as a Republican in Thurston County, and that was enough for her to actually make up about, I want to say it was 40,000 votes or so more in King County than you would or Thurston County than you'd see, and that's how she was able to make up for any deficits that she might have had in other counties. And that was enough usually to help her kind of get over the top in a couple of these elections. That was how she generally looked at the races. But again, you would have to have unusual swings in, say, Snohomish, maybe Spokane, or maybe Pierce County, because those are big counties where you would have some overwhelming support for your Republican candidate in those counties that would help offset whatever percentage below 40% you might be, or if you got a little bit over 40%. But that oftentimes is how people look at it. Republicans are generally not going to win downtown Seattle, but there's still a percentage that they get out of that city. And so you benefit to some extent by making sure that people turn out to vote for you, even if they think they're surrounded by a bunch of libs. It's no different than what I witnessed when I lived in New York City as a college student, watching Rudy Giuliani win in a city that only 15% of the people identified themselves as Republican. And Giuliani was clearly a Republican, and he won overwhelmingly in New York City. That's the kind of thing you're looking for, is the ability to switch, sometimes to see percentages and numbers on the margins. Let's see. Sorry, I'm going to get... there's so many questions coming in here, guys. I wish there was some way... Okay, aren't you... Okay, let me see. Let me look down here on this. Is there a... Okay. Are you going to interview... Sorry, I already did that one, guys. Aren't you outraged? This is from Average Geek Joe. The PDC is moving public comment to be after the enforcement section of the meeting. Well, that's interesting. I would be. I did public comment, I think, last month. I might be missing it this month. I'll have to go double check on when it's coming up on the schedule here. But it's always better to do public comment before and not after. So if they're moving public comment exclusively to the end, if they're having public comment both places, that's great. But our public comment, it's very hard to schedule when that public comment would be at the end. But either way, I would still go to the public comment if I can. So outrage is probably a strong word there. I would strongly suggest they keep it in the beginning. It's always better to get it out of the way. And it's usually better for them too. So I'm surprised that they'd be doing that. I don't know why they think that's going to get better. Let's see. There's a question here from Fro Buffett. Can it get worse than Inslee? Absolutely it can. Just look at Bob Ferguson. That guy is probably worse than Inslee. I mean, Inslee is incompetent and obviously not the smartest guy out there, but you benefit a little bit from the laziness of a politician. I don't think Ferguson's that lazy. I think he's more corrupt and more conniving and more vicious and nasty than Inslee, who's probably more likely to want to just ignore a problem and hope it goes away, whereas Ferguson, I think, is just going to be more vindictive and nasty. And so those are the types of politicians, I think, that do the worst when you get them into public office. So you can always do worse than Inslee. You can probably do worse than Ferguson, but at this point in time, it's a choice, and it is a binary choice, one or the other, right? Ferguson or Reichert. There are really no other options going into the general election. Welcome to the top two primary system. That's how it works. So you can always do worse than Inslee. I'd prefer that we don't do worse than Inslee. Let's see. What are your thoughts? Here it is. This is another question for I Blame Abel. What are your thoughts on Kennedy's running mate, implying that they're considering dropping out and endorsing Trump? So you're talking about the presidential election now. So, you know, the intrigue at a national level when you're running elections, obviously RFK has no chance of winning, right? He's pulling at 5% in the best case, and so you have a spoiler campaign. That's what you really have going on there. And so really both the Republican and the Democrats side, Kamala Harris on one side and Trump on the other, obviously they want those votes because in a close election, and I think this one will be, every vote is going to count, especially in the swing states. It may not count that much in Washington, but it's going to count in these other states for the presidential election. So they're going to want to fight and get the endorsement of as many people as they can under the belief that they'll be able to, that those third-party or small candidates are going to influence how their supporters would vote. Now, the Democrats, I don't know. There's a number of different people have different opinions on this, the national level, and I don't know that I can provide you any more value than you get looking at somebody else when they discuss this. But as a person more associated with Democrat policies in the past, even though RFK has been pretty strong and aggressive against the Biden administration and some of their policies lately, again, he's still only pulling at 5%. And so if he decides to drop out, where do those voters go? I don't know that those voters would necessarily go to Trump or Kamala, but some of them are probably going to. But if he stays in there as a spoiler vote, that probably helps. I would think that helps Trump more than not. I think that's how the Democrats have generally viewed him in that position. And so if he did step out and endorse Trump, I'd be a little surprised, but I don't know how much that really helps him. And dropping out probably, I would assume, hurts Trump a little bit, but it's hard to say. So let's see. Then here's a question from Jason. What's your thoughts on the allegations of Semi Bird threatening to bury people, you put it bury, people reported by Jason Rantz? Well, I mean, I think that's a bad look and a bad reaction that Semi Bird had. If he's using that language, I'm going to bury these people. I think that's particularly foolish, especially since I think what he's referring to are his former military people that he worked with when he was in the military. It's generally not a smart move to go back and go nuclear on everybody in your life that you don't like or that's wronged you. So I don't necessarily see that as being an optimal position for him to be in right now. So I certainly wouldn't do that. If somebody said something that wasn't true or it was a demonstrable lie, that's one thing. But I don't know that that's going to be the situation that Semi's dealing with here right now. Hopefully cooler heads prevail and people are able to resolve it. Somebody's saying not very democratic at all. Is it? I don't know. What, this is Ben, and I don't know what you're referring to there. So that question, I can't answer it because I don't know what you're talking about. This is North Song, a $700,000 increase. I'm assuming that's what you mean by your property tax, if you're the same person that asked the property tax question, or if you're talking about something else there. We need a initiative. This is from Keith Hawkins. We need an initiative to stop all the money grab on auto tags. Keith totally supports you on that. That's not a bad one to run. Probably, if nothing else, just to do it in their face. I'm going to point out that back in the 30s, there was a strong movement in Washington State when the initiative process was added to the Constitution, became a constitutional amendment in 1912. There were a number of things that Washingtonians wanted to do. Clearly, they wanted to ban alcohol, which they did promptly. They also, though, wanted to reduce their taxes. And you see a whole bunch of original initiatives back in the day where they would try to push back on taxes, and then of course the legislature would try to find a way around it, and then they would run another initiative on taxes, and the legislature would find a way around it. And I remember this happened, if you go back and you look in Washington State history, it happened for a decade. And finally it forced, at the time, the Democrat-controlled legislature was forced to go in and make a change to impact and restrict the amount of property taxes that they could increase by. That's one of the examples that I had. There were actually several reforms that came about roughly around that time frame, because year after year, or they wouldn't be like 1 year to the next. It'd be 1 year, and then a couple years later, they'd do it again and again and again. And so the fights over taxes in Washington are not new. They've been going on for 100 years. However, the concentrated benefits distributed cost challenge is a big one when we're looking at trying to reduce these in the past. Auto taxes. We've had 20 years now of a history of multiple times of Washington State voters clearly saying they wanted $30 car tabs, or certainly a reduction in the car tab costs. And the bureaucracy and the administrative state and the bloat and incompetent corruption that exists and dominates and controls those people, it's just like a disease. They're addicted to just increasing those taxes so much. And so I think it's great to run an initiative that would reduce the taxes for car tabs, and if no other reason than just to keep forcing them to justify the unjustifiable. Let's see. There are, I'm trying to get to these next questions. North Song, you mentioned there's a lawsuit in Texas over excessive overvaluation of properties. Yes, there is, and I'm very interested in where that goes. The Department of Revenue in Washington State is going to defend overvaluation. That's what they do. But certain districts in our state have been known to do a particularly bad job at this. And it's going to be, you'll see that they're going to have a very hard time accepting if property values, hit this peak and then they start to fall back down. You're going to see significant struggling going on with the Department of Revenue and the local assessors' offices around the state and how they address that, because they're not going to want to mark down those property values in line with reality. They're happy to jack it up. They're not so happy to follow it back down for the very reason that you've experienced just recently. Do you think it would do, this is from D. Rambo, do you think it would do any good to try a grassroots move by us to contact all other governor candidates to endorse Dave Reichert to keep Ferguson out? I don't think that could hurt. Feel free to. My guess is that some will and some won't, right? But that's probably not a bad idea. That's a better idea than nothing. But I will say there's no magic solution to this. It's just a lot of hard work. And sometimes you need to be lucky too. And I would find a way to figure out how can you guarantee that you have 100 people for sure that you're going to have them vote who don't normally vote, and get them out there to vote for your preferred candidate. In this case, it would be Reichert. So how do you do that? And that's something that that's a highly productive thing that you could do. Let's see. Let's see. If you do interviews before elections, I would love to hear more from Isaac Hoyk and Cliff Moon. Okay, those were legislative candidates, I believe, up in the 21st legislative district. I'd be surprised if they'd want to come down all the way to Clark County for that, but we'll have to see. Let's see, Thunderstriker, Glenn, before I arrive in Seattle, does your hometown have a lot of homeless people and bad weather? It depends on how you define weather. I love the rain, so Washington State has awesome weather. When it comes to homelessness, not so much where I live, but I live out in the rural parts of the state and rural Thurston County, and there aren't a lot of homeless people out there because I've never really seen too many of them living off the land, and I'm a long ways away from any stores or any place like that where they can use, and I'm generally a little distance away, at least from the local meth dealer, probably. Let's see. One Republican event this week. Okay, here, Ben, you had an update here, and I'm assuming this is directed at Thunderstriker, about a Saturday event down Toledo. Looks like Reichert has a rally down there. That's a bit of a distance, but there's... if you want to drive down, that's great. Jason has a question here. What's your thoughts on a carjacking of an 80-year-old in Seattle getting a lot of attention in Seattle media? Well, I mean, I don't know that story specifically, but I'll have to go look at that one. But obviously, crime's on the rise in Seattle. I noticed that Seattle had reached into the top 10, I think, when it came to it was either assaults or burglary. I can't remember now, but it's definitely one of the more violent crimes. Seattle's reaching up into this top tier position that, frankly, from a historical standpoint, Seattle's usually not occupied that. So it's not just drug addicts, homelessness, or car thefts, but also some of the violent crimes. And Seattle's inching its way up there, along with murder rate that has gone up, which I don't believe that it's actually higher than it was, the murder rate, than it was back in the late 80s and early 90s. But nevertheless, it's kind of approaching that kind of situation right now. And, the people of Seattle, they can keep voting in the people that are going to ensure that they have more crime, or they can maybe decide they don't like that so much anymore. And sometimes these obvious crimes that generate a little bit more attention are the kind of thing that's going to help turn some people around anyway. I Blame Abel got a question right here. Nicole mentioned that if they get 5% of the votes, they're considered a real party and get funding. Would the establishment of a third party be better or worse for America? This has been a long question, and for quite a while. I mean, one of the things that Americans are usually mystified when they look at elections in, I don't know, even Canada, but all over Europe, is this kind of multi-party kind of question as to how they organize their governments, and how one party can get a lot more votes like they did in Germany or France or England, and yet get so few representatives when it comes to the people who represent them in their parliament, for example. And then, of course, if they're not a popular party by the establishment, that party gets sidelined while they're trying to find some way of pressing down on them or denying their ability to get representatives. And it takes several election cycles for third parties or new parties, right, to generate that kind of political power within those countries. In America, we've historically always had these two parties. I mean, you had windows of time. I mean, the Republican Party was essentially a third party when it started up, but the Whigs had just basically blown themselves apart. And the Republican Party started as an anti-slavery party, among other things, but particularly an anti-slavery party in the 1850s. Then when you saw like Theodore Roosevelt, for example, jump in with his Bull Moose Party in 1912, he really set the stage to help Woodrow Wilson get into office, which was probably not a good thing for the country because he divided up. And ever since then, every time a third party has been created and popped up on the horizon, it's essentially acted as a spoiler to allow the worst politicians the nation has ever created to get into office. That's typically what happens. So people started as some kind of self-righteous, narcissistic crusade for the third party, but inevitably then what they do is they just simply hand the keys to political power to the worst people they can find. You saw Ross Perot did that in the 90s, and it seems to just keep repeating itself. At least it has for the last 100 years or so. So the question is, what does a third party really do? Can you come in and take over a political party that exists already and shift it more in the direction that you'd want it to go? Generally, that's what you saw the leftist groups do, the Green Party and others. They've generally just simply gone in and occupied the Democrat Party and shifted it more their direction when it came to policies and belief systems. You kind of saw a little bit of this with some of the more libertarian elements also kind of stepping into the Republican side and trying to fit some of their policies into the party platform or the beliefs of the Republicans. Same with Christian coalition waves, same with MAGA or Donald Trump sort of America First sort of things. And that kind of creates these two parties that have factions within them that are fighting over which person or which candidate gets in, and that's why they tend to measure the candidates, whether they have an R or a D next to their name. There still exists on this faction scale. That's a little bit different. I'm not sure the third party has any chance of success right now in America at the national level. I had one of my roommates from college was one of the first libertarians, third party people ever elected in Connecticut. I think it was my senior year or the year after I graduated. I can't remember which year it was, but he'd run for office and ran as a libertarian and actually won and got into the state, the equivalent of the state House of Representatives for Connecticut at the time. So I believe you can do that in certain settings as a third-party candidate in local office. Independents have won in my county, Thurston County, numerous times for both county commissioner and sheriff's races, for example. But I've yet to see that really translate into a much bigger impact outside of these local areas. So I'm just not, I don't see that as a likely outcome here generally. Let's get a couple more questions in here. Let's see. Sorry, guys. Why aren't the bird signs being removed? This is Rebecca Anderson's asking this. Why aren't the bird signs being removed? Okay, this question comes up at the end of every single election cycle, primary and general, and it has for the last 40 or 50 years. What happens is everybody puts their signs out, and when the candidate loses, usually those campaigns aren't so motivated to go out and remove the signs. The volunteers are pissed or they're annoyed or it seems depressing. I definitely recommend that if you worked on those campaigns and you put those signs out, as long as they're not in somebody's personal sign, in their own front yard still, that when you go and you clean up campaign signs, that you try to collect all of them and then, put them out again if they're for your new candidate who's still in the race, or if they aren't, then you recycle the steaks or you do something else with it, but don't leave them out there. It's a constant source of frustration for people who see these old signs up, but I wouldn't get too bent out of shape about it. It happens every single time. So if you know somebody who worked in this campaign, you can ask them if they're going to pick them up. And if they aren't, then usually what happens is the affiliated party, in that case it'd be like the Republican Party, usually they have teams of people that go around and sweep their signs. Democrat Party groups, leftist groups kind of do that too. So, just try to be good neighbors and clean it up as you go along, and then see if you can get them back to the candidate if they still want them, or get them recycled or do something else with them. Let's see. Okay, here's somebody saying that not every homeless person is addicted to meth. Please reconsider that statement. I'm not going to, and I'll tell you why, is because I've actually spent a heck of a long time working around homeless camps and homeless operations in our county. And the truth is, the vast majority, and I say the vast majority, of the people who are in that situation absolutely have a substance abuse. It could be fentanyl, so I might be wrong about it being meth. Could be alcohol, could be some combination. They could have mental health problems. That's like the core reason why they're there. And then they're self-medicating, and so that's why they're on these drugs. But if you were to get a handle and address the drug addiction problem in our community, in these situations, you would go a long ways towards addressing the homeless problem that you have there. And the homeless industrial complex would have to shrink by about 90-95%. So that to ignore that reality is just deny something as obvious as the sun rising tomorrow. In order to fix this problem, you're going to have to address the drug addiction issue and have a solution for people who are addicted to drugs. And I don't see that solution being realistic unless there's some kind of a mandatory detox process for them to go through. And if you've ever been around anybody that's been a drug addict in your family or a friend, or if you watch somebody go down that road, and I have, you cannot just sit back and just throw them in the street and think that's some kind of good way of treating them. It's a terrible way to treat people, and it's unrealistic, it's irrational, it's dishonest, and they have got to get treated because they're functionally incapable of doing it themselves on their own. Especially with fentanyl and meth and just what I've seen, heroin's really in that same category. It becomes just impossible until they're clean for some window of time, and in which case they can start to get their life back in order. And if you've ever been around a drug addict who was an addict for a decent amount of time, and they did turn their life around, they needed something to get them clean and off those drugs, oftentimes for years, before they could get stable in any functional way at all and have any kind of a life or living moving forward. And even then, anybody that's seen drug addicts, once you've been a drug addict, you're essentially always an addict. It's just you may be able to control your life a little bit better or avoid that moving forward. Just like an alcoholic, it's same kind of thing. But I think with fentanyl and meth, it's actually a lot worse. But that's what I've seen. And I think denying that or pretending that that's not true is just extreme self-deception. Let's get in here. Political question. Okay, guys, I'm going to try to catch these last couple questions. We are running out of time. I really want to apologize why I wasn't able to post the questions down below. My fault. I always like having these comments here like this so you can see what question I'm answering. So I'll try to make sure that's fixed next time. Don't know why it didn't work with the screen here. But let's get to a couple other questions here as well. A lot of questions back and forth. How can governments balance national security with individual? This is the same question, Thunderstriker, that you've asked me many other times, and I've tried to answer it, so that one I'm going to skip. But do you believe that there's any outcome of, this is from I Blame Abel, do you believe that there's any outcome of the 2024 election that leads to civil war, and what are those outcomes? Well, I don't know that it's a healthy thing necessarily in a country to be continually discussing the political violence as an inevitable outcome of an election. And, as anybody who studied history, of course, if you looked at the elections in America, even pre-1860, but there was a lot of violence at various times in this country, sometimes regional, sometimes local, sometimes national, especially on the topic of slavery back then, Kansas and these other places where there really was a lot of political violence leading up to the Civil War. And then there was violence in the Reconstruction era for decades after the Civil War. And then you had the anarchists around the turn of the century and the violence that you saw there with political assassinations becoming more and more common at the time. America's dealt with political violence before, and unfortunately we've had that experience all the way, we even had some of that in the 1960s with political assassinations and violence that we saw back then. For the generation that's growing up now, this seems more frightening and unusual to us. And it is in some ways, but a lot of it's manufactured by the way the media covers this and the way that we've unfortunately created these established special interests, where I do believe this distributed cost, concentrated benefits issue really builds up to the point where it creates terrible situations for us because so much money is at stake. For some people, that's their entire existence and their livelihood, the military-industrial complex in some ways, but the bureaucratic industrial complex, the homeless industrial complex, right? Organized crime feeding off of the homeless industrial complex. All of that generates a real troubling problem when it comes to elections and the zero-sum game sort of approach that people have for that election process. I don't think our nation's ever seen the internal political establishment ever align itself so universally against somebody as we've seen with Trump. I've never seen anything like this, neither has anybody else, and I don't find a parallel or a common example in history where there's been such directed rage and lawfare and other attacks directed towards a active presidential candidate. There's really nothing that I can find in our nation's history to be equivalent to what we're seeing right now. Despite the odds, if Trump's able to prevail and clearly be the elected president in November, I would anticipate violence in a lot of the big cities. That's how the left rolls. Antifa and the left-wing billionaires that supported them, I mean, they're going to be paying people to go and burn down cities, and a lot of violence is going to be, I would expect that it's going to be there. I would hope that most people don't react that way. But those divides that occur, unfortunately, there ends up being, it becomes very difficult. You can't find a compromise in many ways between these kind of perspectives because it's not a simple policy dispute. It's both sides viewing control of the federal government in particular as like an existential need for survival. And that's a terrible place to be in a representative form of government because it does create this zero-sum game sort of attitude, and that does tend to produce more violent tendencies and outcomes in certain special interests, whatever they may be. It may be that and it also unfortunately provides an open door to foreign governments that can use those divides as a way to meddle in internal political affairs in America. And that's happened before. So I think we're seeing this. I think we're going to be in for a lot of instability, regardless of who wins the election. But in particular, I think if Trump gets elected, I think the left's going to commit a lot of violence. I've had some videos I think I've done in the past of my concerns over the power grid, the vulnerabilities that exist here on that area, the economic, collapse of the value of the dollar. I mean, I think there's other things that actually are bigger impacts on our nation moving forward than just a bunch of riots that a bunch of, masked Antifa evergreen college students might have. And so we really need to pay attention. Plus, we're living in a dangerous world. There are countries with nuclear weapons out there that don't like us, and that are powerful countries out there as well. They would see this as a tremendous opportunity to bring America down a notch or two, and be vigilant and aware. And one of the things I always tell people is if you should try to be on good terms with your neighbors as best you can, even if you disagree politically. Make sure that you have some way to connect to people, whether or not you share the same desire to elect the same stupid politician into office, that at least as neighbors, you're going to watch out for each other and help each other if times are tough and you need to be able to help. Nobody's an island, and I don't care what kind of prepping survivalist sort of stuff people might view themselves in. You're really not an island. You need other people in order to work together. I live rurally. I try to like to know my neighbors as best I can and find solutions to common problems that we might have. And hopefully we don't have to exercise a lot of those concerns and outcomes, but it's always better to be prepared than not. And we are facing tough times. I do think that elections have consequences, even though I know there's some people watching this channel right now who believe that elections don't matter. I do think they have consequences. But if you're going to make a difference, you got to show up. You got to make an impact. I'd certainly much rather change things by non-violent means than anything that would require that. And boy, if we're into that kind of a situation, our country's in great trouble. And you don't living through that is not, and there's nothing good about that at all. And we want to try to avoid that situation if we can. So get out there, be involved, don't sit back apathetic. And tough times come for everybody, even if you are going to be apathetic and sit back and be lazy. So it'd be best if you're engaged and involved, at least trying to shift the battle in your direction a little bit better. Now, for next week, I do anticipate, thank you guys for all these questions. I know I missed some. Sorry about this process. I'll get that fixed for next week. But I would want to remind everybody that next week we will be talking, probably doing our live stream on Monday. And I believe I'll have some more videos then. You're not going to see any videos coming up on my YouTube channel, but if you can, just make sure to remember to like and subscribe to the channel, share it with others. I do have a couple of videos that have come out recently that have been very popular just in regards to the election results. And I had one video that I think dealt with the question that I've seen raised many times in the comment section for years, every couple years, and it talks about money in politics. And actually, I thought I did a pretty good job with that video, laying it out and explaining why it matters, how it matters, and also how underfunded campaigns can prevail, or the circumstances that allow them to prevail against well-funded campaigns. So hopefully that's helpful, and we will